Hey there, sleepless rebels. Tonight, a small life lesson, one that can actually save your skin. Never judge a book by its cover, because sometimes the sweetest looking people are the ones you should be most careful around. This is the story of an elderly woman who looked harmless, soft voice, gentle smile, the kind of person you'd trust without thinking twice. And that was her greatest weapon. While everyone saw a kind old lady, something far colder was quietly at work behind the scenes. If there's a case you'd like us to cover next, drop it in the comments. We read them all. This is Napmac Stories, and tonight you're listening to a story that proves why appearances can be dangerously misleading. As always, we're starting right at the beginning. Dorothea Helen Gray entered the world in January 1929 in a small Californian town called Redlands, a place quiet enough to forget people and poor enough to make that forgetting routine. There was no omen, no thunder, no dramatic first breath. Just another child born into a family already stretched thin, already tired, already practiced at disappointment. Her father drank. Not in the romantic, tragic way later biographies like to dress up, but in the dull, dependable way that empties paychecks and tempers at the same speed. Her mother existed somewhere between exhaustion and resignation. Love, if present at all, was rationed carefully. Affection was not a language spoken fluently in that household. Survival was. Dorothea learned early that noise attracted attention, and attention invited trouble. So she became quiet. Not shy, not timid. Quiet in the way that watches. Quiet in the way that learns. While other children tested boundaries, Dorothea observed which ones could be crossed without consequence. That skill would stay with her far longer than any childhood friend. The family moved often. Addresses changed. Schools blurred together. Routes never had time to form. And no one noticed when she slipped between the cracks, because those cracks were already crowded. Teachers remembered her as unremarkable. Social workers barely remembered her at all, which, in hindsight, was the first warning sign hiding in plain sight. There is a temptation, when telling stories like this, to search desperately for the moment where everything went wrong. The trauma, the singular event, the broken hinge upon which a life swings, open into darkness. But Dorothea's early years resist that narrative. There was no monster-making factory here. Just neglect, routine disappointment, and a child who learned that people were unreliable. Systems were slow, and sympathy was a currency that could be spent if you knew how to ask for it. She did not dream of greatness. She did not dream of violence. She learned something far more useful. That being overlooked was not a weakness. It was camouflage. And so Dorothea grew up largely unseen. A girl shaped by absence rather than abuse, by indifference rather than cruelty. She learned how to blend into the background of other people's lives, how to take up space without being noticed, how to exist without leaving fingerprints. No one looked closely. No one thought they needed to. Years later, investigators would try to trace the origins of what she became, combing through these early details like archaeologists searching for cracks in a foundation. But the truth is simpler and far more uncomfortable. Nothing dramatic happened here. Drama came a wee bit later. At around 8 years old, Dorothea was hit by a motorcycle. This is the part of the story that people lean forward for. The moment they think explains everything. The neat, medical-sounding pivot that allows everyone to exhale and say, "Ah, there it is. Head injury. Case closed. The accident was real. A collision, a fall, a trip to the hospital." She spent weeks there, removed from the quiet chaos of her home and placed into a different kind of order, white walls, schedules, rules. Adults watched her closely, asked questions, checked charts, paid attention. For a child raised on neglect, that alone would have been an event worth noting. Later accounts describe changes. Teachers said she became flatter, less expressive, more distant. Her grades slipped. Her patience shortened. She learned how to say the right things while meaning very little. Whether this was neurological damage, emotional adaptation, or simply a child adjusting to the reality that life does not improve just because you survive it, no one can say with certainty. What can be said is this: the accident did not create something new. It sharpened something that was already there. Psychologists would later circle this moment like moths around a lamp, eager to turn it into an origin story. But the records are thin. No scans, no definitive diagnoses, just recollections layered with hindsight and the human need for cause and effect. It is far more uncomfortable to accept that nothing supernatural occurred. No switch flipped. No innocence was violently stolen. Dorothea returned home to the same instability, the same indifference, the same slow lessons about how people fail each other quietly. But she returned, changed in one important way. She had learned that harm could arrive without intention, that bodies break easily, that survival does not come with explanations or apologies. She became more observant after that, more selective with emotion. Where other children reacted, Dorothea calculated. She learned when to appear fragile and when to appear compliant. She noticed that adults responded faster to vulnerability than honesty, and that sympathy often arrived with benefits attached. The accident also gave her something else: a story, a detail that followed her into later life, resurfacing whenever explanations were required. A convenient footnote, a medical shrug, something that allowed people to stop asking deeper questions. And Dorothea, perceptive as ever, noticed how useful that was. From that point on, she carried herself with a certain restraint. Not fear, not anger, restraint. She learned that reactions could be expensive, that silence was cheaper, and that the world rarely looks twice at children who cause no obvious trouble. By the time she reached adolescence, Dorothea had mastered the art of seeming smaller than she was. Less complicated, less demanding. The kind of person systems overlook, not because they are invisible, but because they appear manageable. Nothing about her suggested danger, which, in retrospect, was precisely the danger. By the time Dorothea reached adulthood, she had learned something essential. Chaos was not an event. It was a condition. And if you understood that, you could navigate it far more effectively than people who still expected fairness. Her early adult life unfolded without spectacle. No dramatic escapes, no sudden wealth, just movement, from job to job, from man to man, from one temporary arrangement to the next. She married young, then again, then again. The marriages were short, practical, and forgettable. Love was never the point. Stability was. Access was. A last name could open doors, even if only briefly. She worked when she had to. Cleaned, cared, cooked. Positions that required trust but offered little oversight. The kind of roles when no one watched closely unless something went wrong. And nothing ever did. Not obviously. It was during these years that Dorothea began committing crimes so small they barely qualified as such. Forged signatures, altered checks, redirected mail, claimed benefits she was not entitled to. Nothing violent, nothing dramatic, just enough to make life easier without attracting attention. When she was caught, and occasionally she was, the consequences were light. Short jail stays, probation, a stern lecture. She learned another important lesson then. Systems punish disruption, not deception. If you remain calm, compliant, and vaguely apologetic, most institutions are eager to move on. She was not reckless. She did not escalate quickly. Every scheme was tested gently, like a toe dipped into cold water. Could this be done? Would anyone notice? How long did it take for questions to be asked? The answers were reassuring. People assumed incompetence before malice, mistakes before manipulation, especially when the person in front of them was a woman who looked tired rather than dangerous. Dorothea leaned into that assumption effortlessly. She practiced looking overwhelmed, confused, slightly embarrassed. It worked almost every time. Money came and went. So did consequences. But something else was forming underneath. A philosophy shaped not by ideology, but by observation. People trusted stories more than facts. Paperwork mattered more than presence. And those who lived on the margins were rarely followed up on once they disappeared from view. She did not yet think in terms of victims, only opportunities. These early crimes were not a prelude to violence in the way people like to imagine. They were something more practical. Training. Rehearsals conducted in plain sight. Each success confirmed what Dorothea had already suspected. The world was not guarded as closely as it claimed to be. By her 40s, she had been arrested more than once, but never long enough to interrupt her life in any meaningful way. Records accumulated quietly. Patterns went unnoticed. No one connected the dots because no one thought they needed to. She was not charming in the cinematic sense. She was useful, polite, unthreatening. The kind of person institutions barely remember after the file is closed. Violence was still unnecessary. Deception was enough, for now. By middle age, Dorothea Puente no longer thought in terms of look. She thought in terms of systems. She had spent decades brushing up against institutions that claimed to protect people. Welfare officers, housing authorities, courts, hospitals, and she had noticed something important. These systems were not built to notice patterns. They were built to process cases. Once a form was stamped and filed, attention moved on. Permanently. Dorothea learned where responsibility blurred. She learned which departments didn't talk to each other. She learned how long it took for the paperwork to circle back, if it ever did. Most of all, she learned that the people who fell out of these systems were rarely chased. This was not abstract knowledge. It was practical. She knew exactly how benefits were issued, how often identities were checked, how easily mail could be redirected. She understood that a death did not automatically stop a payment. Someone had to notice. Someone had to care. And very often, no one did. During this period, Dorothea positioned herself carefully. She was no longer just another struggling woman on the margins. She became helpful, reliable, the kind of person social workers remembered kindly, if they remembered her at all. She volunteered information, offered assistance, asked the right questions in the right tone. She learned how to present herself as a problem solver. Her criminal activity continued, but it changed in character, less impulsive, more procedural. She didn't steal from strangers anymore. She embedded herself into situations where trust was assumed and oversight was minimal, where people needed help and were grateful not to be alone. She gravitated toward those who were already slipping out of view. The elderly, the sick, the addicted, the mentally unwell. Not because she hated them, not because she enjoyed their suffering, but because their disappearance did not cause friction. They were already halfway gone in the eyes of the world. This is where the myth usually starts to creep in. The idea that something snapped, that greed overwhelmed restraint, that desperation pushed her too far. But nothing snapped. What happened instead was a refinement. Dorothea began to understand that stability didn't require legitimacy. It required consistency, a fixed address, a role that made sense on paper, something that explained her presence in other people's lives without raising questions. She did not yet own anything. She did not need to. Control was cheaper than ownership. By the late 1970s, she was no longer drifting. She was positioning, watching neighborhoods, watching people, watching which kinds of suffering came with checks attached, watching how easily responsibility could be delegated to someone who looked willing to accept it. The idea of housing others did not arrive fully formed. It emerged slowly, as all practical ideas do. One room, then another. A favor here. A small payment there. An arrangement that solved problems for everyone involved. On paper, she was helping. In reality, she was assembling a framework. A place where people arrived quietly. A place where money followed them. A place where no one checked too closely what happened next. By the time Dorothea moved toward what would later be called her boarding house, she was not improvising. She was applying lessons learned patiently, over decades. She had not yet killed anyone, but she had already built the conditions that made killing unnecessary to notice. The house on F Street did not look dangerous. It sat in Sacramento like countless others, a little tired, a little crowded, slightly out of step with the city growing around it. A place with history, but no prestige. The kind of building people pass without curiosity, which was exactly the point. Dorothea did not arrive there as an owner. She arrived as a tenant. That detail matters, because it reveals how little ambition had to do with what followed. She was not chasing property. She was securing position. The owners lived elsewhere. Management was distant. Oversight was theoretical. Dorothea, dependable and present, became useful. When repairs were needed, she reported them. When tenants complained, she mediated. When rooms became vacant, she helped fill them. Slowly, quietly, she became the person everyone deferred to. No paperwork announced the change, no ceremony marked it. Authority simply accumulated around her, the way dust settles in unused corners. She learned the rhythms of the house quickly. Who stayed out late? Who drank too much? Who had no visitors? Who received checks at the beginning of the month and little else for the remaining weeks? She noticed which doors stayed closed, and which people wouldn't be missed for days at a time. What began as informal help became routine. Dorothea collected rent, she managed keys, she spoke to social workers on behalf of residents who found forms confusing or officers intimidating. She redirected mail for convenience. She framed herself as a buffer between vulnerable people and an unfriendly world. On paper, this was caretaking. In practice, it was consolidation. Rooms filled with tenants no one else wanted. Men with failing health. Women with fragile minds. People living on disability checks and government assistance. People grateful for shelter and not inclined to ask questions about how things were run. The house slowly transformed into something else. Not officially. There were no signs, no licenses proudly displayed. But functionally it became a boarding house. One that solved problems efficiently. Social services had somewhere to place difficult cases. Residents had a roof. Dorothea had control. Money flowed predictably. Small amounts, but steady. The kind of income that doesn't attract scrutiny because it never spikes. The kind that survives unnoticed because it looks like subsistence rather than profit. She made herself indispensable. When officials called, she answered. When residents struggled, she intervened. She learned how to speak in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions while sounding cooperative enough to invite trust. By the early 1980s, the house was hers in every way that mattered, without the inconvenience of ownership. It provided access, privacy, and a rotating population of people whose lives were already considered transitional. Nothing illegal needed to happen yet. That's the part that often gets misunderstood. The house did not begin as a crime scene. It began as an efficient solution to other people's problems. A place where responsibility could be delegated and forgotten. Dorothea didn't need secrecy. She needed normalcy. And the house on F Street provided it. Quietly. Consistently. And without asking too many questions. Inside its walls, she finally had what she had spent decades refining the skills to maintain. Stability. People arrived at the house on F Street carrying very little with them. A bag of clothes, a prescription bottle, a story that had already been told too many times to officers that no longer listened. By the time they reached Dorothea's door, most of them were tired of explaining themselves. Dorothea liked that. Her residents were not chosen at random. They were selected by circumstance. The elderly with no family. Men whose health had begun to fail quietly. People living on disability, veterans' benefits, or welfare checks that arrived on time even when they did not. They were not invisible to the state, just uninteresting. She greeted them warmly, helped them settle in, explained the rules gently, as though the rules were for their own protection. Curfews, quiet hours, medication schedules. She framed control as care, and most accepted it gratefully. Life had taught them that stability often came with conditions attached. Dorothea made herself essential. She handled paperwork. She offered to keep documents safe. She collected checks to help residents avoid being taken advantage of. For many, it felt like relief. Someone else was finally in charge. Someone competent. Power shifted slowly, the way it always does when no one is watching. Mail began arriving in Dorothea's hands first. Phone calls went through her. Questions from social workers were answered by her, often before residents knew they had been asked. The house did not just shelter people, it filtered them. Dependency followed naturally. Residents relied on Dorothea for food, for access to money, for explanations of bureaucratic letters they didn't understand. She decided who was capable and who was confused, who was improving and who was declining. These judgments rarely needed to be challenged. No one else was close enough to do so. The residents noticed things, of course. They noticed that people came and went, that rooms changed occupants quickly, that some neighbors were there one day and gone the next. But lives like theirs had taught them not to ask questions that led nowhere. Silence was safer. Dorothea encouraged that silence without ever demanding it. She didn't threaten. She didn't intimidate. She simply positioned herself as the only reliable constant in an unstable world. Complaints felt pointless when voiced against someone who seemed so helpful, so calm, so permanently present. Money continued to arrive. Checks stacked neatly. Benefits flowed. Dorothea managed it all with a practiced hand. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that would attract notice. She understood the value of moderation. Excess raised eyebrows. Consistency did not. At this stage, death was still incidental. People with fragile health died, as people like this often did. When they did, Dorothea handled the aftermath smoothly. She informed the right officers, sometimes. Other times she waited. She observed how long it took for questions to arise. Usually none did. That was the moment the house truly changed. Not when the first resident died, but when Dorothea realized that death created fewer problems than life. The residents were already living quietly on the margins. When one disappeared, the world adjusted without complaint. Rooms emptied. Paperwork lagged behind reality. Payments continued. Dorothea did not react emotionally to this discovery. She simply filed it away, like everything else she learned. The house was full now. The system was functioning, and Dorothea, for the first time, was not improvising. She was managing. The paperwork came before the violence. That part is often misunderstood. Long before Dorothea Puente considered killing anyone, she discovered something far more useful. Death did not immediately interrupt income. It merely complicated it, briefly. And complications, she had learned, were manageable. When residents died from natural causes, liver failure, heart problems, complications of age or addiction, Dorothea handled the aftermath with practiced calm. She notified some officers promptly. Others could wait. There was no single authority overseeing the process. No red button that shut everything down at once. Each benefit belonged to a different system. Each system moved at its own pace. Checks still arrived. At first, Dorothea hesitated. Not out of morality, but out of caution. She tested the limits gently. One check cashed late. Another redirected. A signature forged with care. She watched to see what would happen. Nothing did. There were no phone calls demanding explanations. No investigators at the door. The absence of reaction was more informative than any warning could have been. It told her exactly how much room she had. So she adjusted her behaviour accordingly. She began to retain documents after residents died. IDS social security cards, bank letters. She justified it easily. The paperwork would be needed later, she told herself. And sometimes that was even true. But mostly it meant control. She learned how long payments continued after death. Which benefits stopped quickly. Which lingered for months. She discovered that the system relied on honesty more than verification, and that honesty was assumed far more often than it was enforced. Dorothea did not splurge. She did not buy anything that suggested sudden wealth. She paid bills, bought groceries, maintained the house just enough to keep it functional. The money disappeared into normal life, which made it invisible. This was not greed in the dramatic sense. It was optimization. The residents themselves rarely noticed anything was wrong. Their lives had already taught them that money was something other people handled. Dorothea reinforced that belief gently. She reassured them, explained delays, smoothed confusion. She spoke the language of bureaucracy fluently enough to make resistance feel unnecessary. When someone questioned her, and occasionally someone did, she responded with mild offense, hurt feelings, confusion. Why would anyone doubt her intentions? Didn't she spend all her time helping these people? Didn't she barely get by herself? That strategy worked remarkably well. At this stage, no one had been killed deliberately, but the calculation had begun. Dorothea understood that death removed unpredictability. Illness lingered. Complaints accumulated. Dependency came with needs. Death simplified everything. She did not rush toward that conclusion. She did not need to. The system had already taught her the most dangerous lesson of all, that people could vanish slowly, and the world would not interrupt itself to notice. Paperwork lagged behind reality. Reality adjusted quietly, and Dorothea Puente took notes. By the time she realized that death could be useful rather than inconvenient, she was not crossing a moral boundary. She was refining a process that already existed. The house continued to function. The checks continued to arrive. And Dorothea, patient as ever, waited for the moment when efficiency would require a firmer hand. There was no single moment when Dorothea Puente decided to kill. No argument that escalated too far. No loss that snapped something inside her. No dramatic descent. What happened instead was far more ordinary and far more unsettling. She reached a conclusion the same way she reached most of them, by observing what worked. By the early 1980s, the house was running smoothly. Residents came and went, payments arrived. Paperwork lagged behind reality just long enough to be useful. Dorothea had learned how to manage illness, addiction, and decline. But decline was inefficient. It required patience, care, attention, and attention, she knew, invited scrutiny. Some residents lingered. They complained. They needed medication adjusted. They attracted social workers who asked follow-up questions. They disrupted the quiet equilibrium Dorothea had worked so carefully to establish. Death, by contrast, was final, clean in its own way. It ended conversations, it stopped complaints, it removed variables. Dorothea didn't frame this as murder, not internally. She framed it as resolution. The first deliberate killing was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no visible struggle, just medication administered a little too generously. A body that failed in a way that looked familiar, expected even. In a house filled with fragile people, death was never surprising. Afterward, Dorothea waited. She watched for reactions, for questions, for consequences. None came. The absence of response confirmed what she had already suspected. The system did not distinguish between accidental death and intentional death, if both arrived quietly and in the right setting. The paperwork moved at the same pace. The checks continued for the same length of time. The world adjusted itself without asking why. That was the moment the calculation settled. From then on, Dorothea chose victims carefully. She did not kill impulsively. She selected residents whose absence would raise the fewest questions. Those with no close family. Those already labeled difficult or declining. Those whose deaths would be explained away by their own histories. She used methods that required no strength and left little evidence. Overdoses that mimicked medical mismanagement. Suffocation that left no obvious marks. Each death folded seamlessly into the narrative the house already provided. She buried them in the yard not out of panic, but convenience. Transporting bodies created risk, burial created permanence. The garden became part of the system, a quiet extension of the house's function. Flowers planted above the graves were not symbolism, they were camouflage. Dorothea did not celebrate these deaths. She did not dwell on them. Once they were handled, she moved on. Rooms were cleaned, belongings were sorted, new residents arrived, life continued. This was not violence driven by rage or pleasure. It was administrative. The emotional distance that had defined her since childhood now served a different purpose. Killing did not feel transgressive. It felt procedural. By the time a pattern could have been noticed, Dorothea had already refined it. The house absorbed death the way it absorbed everything else. Quietly, efficiently, and without protest. What changed was not her behaviour. What changed was her understanding. Death was no longer an outcome she reacted to. It was a tool she controlled. And with that realization, the house on F Street became something else entirely. A place where people did not just disappear from view. They were deliberately removed. That is the most unsettling thing about what followed. Not the violence itself, but how quickly it settled into the background of daily life. Dorothea Puente did not become more erratic. She became more efficient. Death stopped being an event and started behaving like maintenance. The routine was simple. A resident's health declined, or their presence became inconvenient. Dorothea waited. She observed. She chose timing carefully. There were no patterns obvious enough. To draw attention, no cluster of deaths close enough together to invite scrutiny. Everything happened slowly, spaced just far enough apart to feel natural. She continued to cook meals, to chat with neighbours, to speak politely with social workers on the phone. The house did not change its appearance. No screams, no police visits, no visible signs of disruption. The ordinariness was part of the design. Bodies were dealt with methodically. Dorothea wrapped them in plastic, not out of panic, but to keep things clean. She buried them in shallow graves in the backyard because it was practical. Transporting bodies required vehicles, witnesses, risk. The garden required none of those. The soil did the rest. Afterward, she returned to her routines. Laundry, dishes, paperwork. The mail still arrived. Checks were still cashed. New residents filled old rooms. Life at the house maintained its rhythm, absorbing loss without hesitation. Residents noticed absences, of course, but they had learned not to linger on them. People disappeared from their lives all the time, to hospitals, to shelters, to jail, to the street. Dorothea supplied explanations when necessary. Someone had moved on, someone had relapsed, someone had gone to stay with family. These stories were accepted because they sounded familiar. She never spoke about death with drama. She never framed herself as a victim of circumstance. She presented herself as tired, overworked, endlessly patient. The image held. Authority figures rarely questioned someone who seemed so burdened already. The killings themselves became quieter over time, faster, less uncertain. Dorothea refined her methods to avoid mess, noise, or visible injury. She chose techniques that matched the residents' medical histories, ensuring that even if a death was examined, it would not stand out. Emotionally, she remained flat. There were no recorded outbursts, no confessions, no slips of the tongue. If guilt existed, it left no trace. Killing did not excite her. It solved problems. What changed during this period was scale. One death became two. Two became several. The house became layered with absence, even as it remained physically full. Each burial made the next one easier. Each successful disappearance reinforced the lesson that had been forming since her youth. People vanish every day, and the world rarely interrupts itself to ask why. By the mid-1980s, Dorothea was no longer improvising or adapting. She was repeating a process she trusted. The routine protected her. Familiarity dulled risk. Predictability replaced fear. And still, no one came looking. The system did not react. Neighbors did not question. Authorities did not connect the dots. The house on F Street continued to function like any other place where unwanted people were sent to wait out the end of their usefulness. Only Dorothea knew what that end really looked like, and she kept it buried, literally and figuratively, beneath layers of normal life, paperwork, and flowers that bloomed reliably each season. Routine had done what impulse never could. It had made murder disappear into the background. By the time Dorothea Puente had buried several people in her backyard, the most important condition for her continued success was firmly in place. No one was looking. This was not because she was especially clever or uniquely skilled at deception. It was because the system surrounding her had already decided, quietly and without coordination, that the people passing through her house did not require close attention. Social services assumed housing handled the problem. Housing assumed medical decline explained the rest. Medical services assumed paperwork would catch up eventually. And paperwork, as Dorothea knew well, moved at its own leisurely pace. The residents of the house existed at the intersection of categories that rarely triggered urgency: poor, sick, elderly, addicted, alone. Their lives were already filed under temporary, even when no one used the word out loud. When they disappeared, the explanation arrived before the question. Dorothea benefited enormously from this fragmentation. No single agency tracked the full arc of a resident's life. No one noticed how often names stopped appearing on forms without explanation. Each disappearance was processed as an isolated event, not part of a pattern. Occasionally someone asked. A social worker noticed a familiar name was missing. A benefits clerk flagged a delayed report. Dorothea handled these moments calmly. She had answers ready: hospitalizations, relapses, estranged family members, transitions to other facilities. None of these explanations were extraordinary. That was their strength. Her tone mattered as much as her words. She sounded tired, but cooperative, burdened, but responsible. The kind of person authorities preferred to trust rather than challenge, because challenging her would mean admitting they hadn't been paying attention themselves. Neighbors saw very little. The house was quiet. There were no fights spilling into the street. No loud visitors. No obvious chaos. Dorothea gardened. She waved. She looked like a woman doing her best with difficult circumstances. And people like that are rarely suspected. The checks continued to arrive. Some stopped eventually. Others lingered longer than expected. Dorothea adjusted accordingly. She knew when to notify an office and when silence was more profitable. Each delay reinforced the lesson she had learned years earlier. Death created paperwork problems, but paperwork problems were survivable. What's striking is not that the system failed once or twice. It failed consistently, predictably, almost mechanically. Every missing resident tested the same assumption, that someone else would notice first. No one ever did. By the late 1980s, Dorothea had achieved something few criminals ever manage. She operated in plain sight, surrounded by professionals without triggering sustained attention. The house did not look like a crime scene because it did not disrupt expectations. It looked like exactly what society imagined happened to people who reached the end of the line. This wasn't invisibility in the magical sense. It was bureaucratic invisibility, far more reliable, the kind that comes from being categorized correctly and then forgotten. Dorothea did not celebrate this. She didn't need to. The absence of interference spoke for itself. Each passing month without scrutiny confirmed that the arrangement was stable, until eventually it wasn't. Because systems don't fail forever. They fail until someone stumbles into the wrong file, asks the wrong question, or notices the same name missing one too many times. And somewhere beyond the house on F Street, that moment was quietly approaching. The system did not collapse all at once. It never does. It faltered the way systems always falter, because one person paid attention for slightly longer than required. In 1988, a social worker noticed something that had been happening for years. A resident of the house on F Street was missing. Not transferred, not hospitalized, not officially deceased, just gone. The file didn't close cleanly. A benefit payment didn't line up. A routine question didn't receive a routine answer. Normally this would have ended there. A note in the margin. A quiet assumption. But this time, the question came back. And then, it came back again. Dorothea responded as she always had. Calm, cooperative, mildly inconvenienced. She explained that the man had left, that he had gone elsewhere, that she wasn't entirely sure where. These things happened, didn't they? People drifted. Especially people like him. The explanation should have worked. It had worked dozens of times before. But something about the repetition unsettled the social worker. Too many names, too many loose ends, too many residents who seemed to evaporate rather than move on. The paperwork told a story, but it wasn't a convincing one anymore. For the first time, someone looked beyond Dorothea's words and into the pattern behind them. Authorities were contacted. Files were compared. Questions were asked that required more than a phone call to answer. The house on F Street, so quiet for so long, began to attract a different kind of attention. Procedural, methodical, unavoidable. When investigators arrived, Dorothea did not panic. Panic suggested guilt. Panic invited mistakes. She greeted them politely, answered questions, maintained the role she had perfected over decades. The overworked caretaker, burdened by responsibility, confused by bureaucracy. They asked about residents who had vanished. She supplied explanations. They asked about records. She produced what she could. But this time, the questions did not stop at the front door. They asked about the yard. The request to search the property was framed gently, almost apologetically. Dorothea listened, nodded, absorbed the information, and then she did something that would become legend. She excused herself. She said she was going out for coffee. There was no urgency in her voice, no visible fear, just the tone of someone stepping away from an inconvenience. She left the house calmly and did not return. Behind her, investigators began to dig. The garden resisted at first. Soil packed down, roots tangled, flowers thriving. But beneath the surface, the house finally gave up what it had been holding. Plastic, fabric, bone. 7 bodies were uncovered, carefully wrapped, buried shallow enough to be practical, deep enough to avoid detection. The routine laid bare at last. Dorothea was arrested days later. The house on F Street fell silent. Neighbors expressed shock. Officials expressed regret. Paperwork was suddenly very interested in catching up. Files were reopened. Names were reread. Questions were asked that should have been asked years earlier. But Dorothea herself remained unchanged. When taken into custody, she did not confess. She did not explain. She did not perform remorse. She simply entered another system. This one slower and more deliberate than the last. For years, the house had absorbed death without consequence. Now, at last, the questions had found their way to the surface. And they were not going away. When investigators began digging in the backyard of the house on F Street, they were not expecting scale. They were following procedure, not intuition. A shallow search, a formality prompted by unanswered questions and one social worker who refused to close a file cleanly. The garden looked ordinary, well kept, almost cheerful, flowers planted in neat rows. Soil recently turned, but not suspiciously so. Gardening was, after all, what older women were supposed to do. The first discovery came quickly. Plastic. Not trash, not debris, something deliberate, something wrapped, then fabric, then bone. At that point, the search stopped being cautious and started being methodical. Each spadeful of earth peeled back another layer of normality. What had been dismissed as a yard became a graveyard with boundaries defined by convenience rather than ritual. 7 bodies were uncovered. They were wrapped carefully, sealed against the soil, placed in shallow graves that spoke not of haste, but of calculation. These were not frantic burials. They were planned, measured, repeated. The victims varied in age and condition, but they shared a defining trait. No one had been actively looking for them. Their disappearances had not triggered alarms. Their deaths had not disrupted systems. They had faded from records before they had faded from the ground. Investigators were struck by the consistency, the method of burial, the placement, the spacing. This was not improvisation. It was process. Inside the house, the evidence continued to align. Belongings of former residents remained neatly stored. Identification documents, personal papers, letters that had never been sent. The absence of chaos was itself incriminating. Lives had been ended, but disorder had not followed. As names were matched to remains, a second realization settled in. These were only the bodies that could be found. Soil disturbances suggested more digging had occurred than could be accounted for by 7 graves alone. Bones that could not be identified raised further questions. How many more had passed through this yard without ever being named? The house, once described as a refuge, became something else entirely in the public imagination. Media arrived. Neighbors spoke in stunned tones. Officials reviewed files with new urgency. The system, embarrassed at last, attempted to reconstruct what it had ignored. Dorothea Puente was no longer present to explain or deflect. She had vanished before the first body was fully uncovered, leaving behind only the results of her routine. The garden told a story she never would. It showed duration, it showed intention, it showed that death had been integrated into daily life, not hidden in panic. For investigators, the yard was the proof they needed, not just of murder, but of repetition, of a crime that had relied not on secrecy, but on predictability, on the assumption that no one would look closely enough, for long enough, to notice what lay beneath a familiar surface. By the time the digging ended, the house on F Street was no longer just a crime scene. It was evidence of something larger, a place where people had been removed quietly, efficiently, and with such regularity that the ground itself had learned to keep the secret. The question was no longer whether Dorothea Puente had killed. The question was how long she had been doing it, and how many times the world had failed to notice. This is where imagination usually gets in the way of reality. People picture lifting, carrying, straining arms and staggering steps. They imagine a frail woman attempting the impossible and failing repeatedly until something supernatural must be added to the story. Accomplices, adrenaline, madness, none of that is necessary. Dorothea Puente did not carry bodies. She never needed to. She waited. That was always her advantage. There was no urgency once a resident was dead. No one expected company. No one checked in unexpectedly. The house settled into its nighttime quiet. The kind that comes from exhaustion rather than peace. Doors stayed closed. Radios murmured. Medication did its work. When she moved a body, she did it close to the ground. Wrapping came first. Plastic. Tightly secured. Not for concealment, but for control. Plastic contains limbs. It reduces drag. It turns a human body into a single shape that slides instead of the collapses. Dragging requires far less strength than lifting. Gravity does most of the work. Investigators later noted patterns consistent with bodies being pulled, not carried. There were no signs of struggle, because there had been no struggle to begin with. The distance mattered. Bedrooms were near exits. The yard was immediately accessible. There were no staircases to navigate, no fences to hoist over. This was not a journey. It was a short relocation. Time was another overlooked factor. Dorothea didn't rush. She could stop, rest, adjust her grip, continue. Tasks imagined as impossible in one motion become manageable when broken into increments. Furniture is moved this way every day. Bodies are not heavier simply because they are dead. And these bodies were not what people imagine either. Many of the residents were already frail, ill, and underweight. Years of sickness had done much of the work long before Dorothea ever touched them. The idea of hauling a robust adult male across the yard belongs to television, not this house. Digging followed the same logic. The graves were shallow because they only needed to delay discovery, not prevent it indefinitely. Soil was turned over time, not in a single exhausting effort. Gardening provided cover. Fresh dirt explained itself when flowers appeared. Nothing about this required extraordinary strength. It required privacy, patience, and a complete absence of interruption. That last part mattered most. No one knocked on the door. No one came looking. No one questioned the sounds of dragging, scraping, digging, if they were heard at all. Because people do not listen closely to houses like this. They expect quiet suffering, not crimes in progress. And Dorothea knew that expectation protected her better than secrecy ever could. This was not a crime enabled by physical power. It was enabled by environment, by familiarity, by the knowledge that no one was counting how many times the yard was disturbed, or why. When investigators later asked how she managed it, the question revealed more about them than about her. They had imagined resistance where there had been none, difficulty where there had been time. Dorothea Puente did not overcome her limitations. She designed her crimes around them, and that, more than anything else, is what allowed her to keep going. Quietly, repeatedly, and right behind a house that looked exactly like the place people expected suffering to end. Dorothea Puente did not stay to watch the ground give her away. When investigators arrived at the house on F Street with questions that could no longer be deflected, she listened carefully. She nodded. She appeared cooperative. She absorbed the request to search the property without protest. And then, with the calm politeness she had perfected over a lifetime, she excused herself. She said she was going out for coffee. It did not sound like a lie. It sounded like routine, like a woman stepping away from an inconvenience rather than fleeing a crime scene. There was no urgency in her voice, no rush in her movements. She took her purse, she walked out the door, and she never came back. This was not panic, it was calculation. Dorothea understood timing. She knew that the search would take hours, that paperwork would slow things down, that confirmation would lag behind suspicion. Leaving early meant leaving quietly, before certainty hardened into handcuffs. She did not get far. For several days, Dorothea moved through Northern California, staying with acquaintances, drifting between temporary shelters, blending into environments where older women were common and unremarkable. She did not change her appearance. She did not attempt anything dramatic. She relied on the same invisibility that had protected her for decades. Meanwhile, the ground behind her was speaking. As bodies were uncovered, the search for Dorothea intensified. Her name moved from local concern to national attention almost overnight. Photographs circulated. Alerts went out. The story was too grotesque, too improbable to remain contained. She was arrested in Los Angeles just days after she walked away from the house. There was no chase, no confrontation. When police approached her, she did not resist. She did not deny who she was. She did not ask what they had found. She allowed herself to be taken into custody with the same quiet compliance that had always served her well. The contrast was striking. A woman accused of burying bodies under her roses stood calmly as officers led her away. No outburst, no collapse, no visible fear. It unsettled people more than panic ever could have. From that moment on, Dorothea Puente entered a different kind of waiting. The house was sealed. The garden became evidence. Files were reopened. Questions multiplied. And Dorothea, now unmistakably visible, was placed inside a system far slower and more deliberate than any she had exploited before. She had used time as a shield for years. Now time would be used against her. But even then, she did not rush to explain herself. She had never believed explanations were necessary. When Dorothea Puente finally appeared in court, the case had already aged. 4 years had passed since the bodies were uncovered. 4 years of evaluations, motions, delays, and arguments about whether an elderly woman in poor health was capable of standing trial at all. Time had done what it always does in cases like this. It softened urgency and complicated certainty. Dorothea entered the courtroom smaller than people expected. Older, slower, dressed plainly, often in muted colors that emphasized fragility rather than defiance. She leaned into the image without exaggerating it. No theatrics, no trembling confessions, just quiet presence. The prosecution laid out a pattern rather than a spectacle. They spoke of residents who arrived with checks and disappeared without explanation, of payments that continued after deaths, of documents kept, signatures forged, lives reduced to paperwork and profit. The garden, once ordinary, became central evidence, a ledger written in soil. But the case was not as simple as the headline suggested. 7 bodies had been found, but not all could be definitively linked to murder. Some deaths could plausibly be explained by overdose or illness. Time had erased details that might have clarified cause. The very neglect that allowed Dorothea to operate had also weakened the case against her. The defense seized on this. They portrayed Dorothea as overwhelmed rather than calculating, as confused rather than malicious. They argued that residents were sick, addicted, prone to vanishing, that deaths were tragic but expected, that any financial irregularities were misunderstandings, not schemes. Dorothea herself remained mostly silent. When she did speak, it was to deny intent. She did not argue facts aggressively. She simply rejected the conclusions drawn from them. She had helped people, she said. She had done her best. She had never hurt anyone. The jury was asked to look past appearances, not just Dorothea's, but the system's. To see pattern where institutions had once seen coincidence. To accept that violence did not always arrive loudly or leave obvious wounds. In the end, the verdict reflected both certainty and limitation. Dorothea Puente was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder. Not 7, not 15, 3. The cases where intent and method could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The rest remained suspended in the grey space between suspicion and proof. She received a sentence of life in prison, without the possibility of parole. There was no outburst when the verdict was read, no visible reaction. Dorothea listened, nodded slightly, and allowed herself to be led away. The performance, if it could be called that, never broke. Outside the courtroom, reactions were divided between relief and discomfort. Relief that she would never return to the house on F Street. Discomfort at how much had gone unanswered. How many names remained unspoken? How many disappearances would never be fully explained? Justice had arrived, but it had arrived cautiously. The trial closed the case legally, but not emotionally. It left behind a question that would linger long after the courtroom emptied. How many times had the truth passed quietly through official hands and been set aside because it was inconvenient to look at too closely? Dorothea did not answer that question. She never intended to. Prison did not transform Dorothea Puente. It contained her. She was sent to the Central California Women's Facility, a place built for routine rather than reflection. Concrete schedules, controlled movement, meals at fixed hours, the kind of environment where time stops pretending to be flexible. For Dorothea, this was not unfamiliar territory. She had lived her entire life inside systems, exploiting them, navigating them, waiting them out. Prison was simply a system that no longer deferred to her. She kept to herself. Guards described her as compliant, polite, forgettable. She did not cause trouble. She did not seek attention. She followed rules carefully, the way people do when rules are no longer optional. Among other inmates, she avoided deep relationships. Trust had never been her preferred currency. There were no public breakdowns, no religious awakenings, no televised remorse. Dorothea maintained her long-standing position. She had done nothing wrong. When asked about the case, she dismissed it as misunderstanding, exaggeration, hysteria. People had died? Yes, but people like that always did, didn't they? She did not speak about the house. She did not speak about the garden. She did not speak about the dead. What she did speak about occasionally was herself, her health, her age, how difficult prison life was for an elderly woman. These complaints were not dramatic. They were practical, consistent, delivered in the same tone she had used for decades when describing hardship. She filed grievances, requested accommodations, navigated the prison bureaucracy with familiar patience. Even here, she understood how to work within a system without appearing to challenge it. Other inmates reacted to her presence in predictable ways. Some were curious, some hostile, some simply avoided her. The story of the house followed her, whispered and half remembered. Dorothea never corrected it. Silence remained her preferred defense. Years passed this way. Outside the prison walls, interest in her case faded. New crimes replaced old ones in headlines. The house on F Street changed hands. The garden was dug up, restored, replanted. Life continued its quiet erasure of what it found uncomfortable. Inside, Dorothea aged. Her movements slowed, her body shrank, her voice softened further. To casual observers, she became exactly what she had always appeared to be, a harmless old woman worn down by time. The illusion persisted even now, despite everything that had been proven. She never admitted guilt, never offered explanation, never asked for forgiveness. When she died in 2011 at the age of 82, it was from natural causes. There was no drama at the end, no final statement, no revelation waiting to be uncovered. She left behind no confession. Only records, only files, only unanswered questions buried in places that would never be searched again. Prison had not changed Dorothea Puente. It had simply removed her from circulation. Dorothea Puente died quietly, but the case did not. In the years after her conviction, the house on F Street became an address people spoke about carefully, as though saying it too loudly might invite something back. Neighbors moved, owners changed, the garden was replanted. Soil was turned again, this time openly, deliberately, as if certainty could be restored through effort. It couldn't. Investigators revisited records long after the trial ended. Names resurfaced, files were re-examined, benefits payments were traced backward through time, revealing gaps where people should have been and simply weren't. Each review raised the same uncomfortable possibility. The bodies found in the yard were not the full count. But possibility is not proof, and proof, after so much time, had become scarce. Some former residents were never located. Some deaths were never reclassified. Some families were never notified because no one knew where to find them. The system that had once failed to notice disappearances now struggled to reconstruct them. Public discussion shifted slowly from the woman to the environment that had allowed her to operate. Dorothea Puente was no longer framed as an anomaly, but as an outcome. A product of neglect layered upon neglect, of institutions designed to manage risk rather than prevent harm, of people deemed too inconvenient to track closely. The phrase, "no one noticed," appeared often in reporting. It became shorthand for something larger, not just a failure of oversight, but a failure of priority. The people who died in Dorothea's house had been categorized long before they were buried. Their invisibility had not begun with her. Dorothea herself never contributed to this conversation. She left no memoir, no confession, no final clarification. Whatever explanations existed died with her, sealed behind a lifetime of silence. That silence proved durable. The house remains standing. The street still exists. People pass it every day without knowing what once lay beneath the surface. And that, perhaps, is the most accurate ending this story could have. There was no reckoning that reached all the way down. No moment when every question was answered. No list of names made complete. Justice arrived, but it arrived selectively, constrained by evidence and time. Dorothea Puente did not vanish into myth. She vanished into records, case numbers, transcripts, reports, the same way her victims vanished from systems that never expected them to matter. What remains is not the image of an old woman or a garden or a headline. What remains is the lesson people rarely want to sit with. That crimes like this do not require monsters. They require patience. They require access. They require a world willing to look away long enough for routine to harden into habit. Dorothea Puente is gone. The conditions that made her possible are not. And they never needed to be buried to disappear. And that's where this story ends. Sleepless rabble. If it kept you company tonight, like the episode, subscribe, and stay with us. It helps keep these stories alive. And if there's another case you want us to dive into, something dark, strange, or quietly disturbing, leave it in the comments. This is NapMac Stories, where not everything is what it seems. Sleep well, and remember, some covers are meant to deceive,